So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We do have participants on our live stream as well. Wave hello to them. And thank you for being here in person on a beautiful fall day where you could be somewhere else, but we think it'll be worth your while. So we appreciate you. And I'd like to first introduce myself. I'm Dr. Kinan McKenzie, and I'm the director of the Generous Listening and Dialogue Center, which we refer to as GLADC. So if you hear that term tonight, that is what we are referring to. I'm also joined by my colleagues here from GLADC, and I will be introducing them on the slides here, but they're also in the room. First, we have our esteemed guests who are seated in the front. Many of you got to say hello, and after we do a couple of introductions, we will be getting to our panel discussion. With us in the room from our GLADC team, they are working, so they may or may not be able to wave at you at this time, but their pictures are here. We have, of course, myself. We have Dr. Deborah Donahue-Keegan, who is in the back, right there waving at you. We also have James Fisher over here to the right, who is our program administrator. And we have Dr. Jihyang Padma, who is our liaison to the chaplaincy over here and our Buddhist chaplain at Tufts University. So I also want to thank the students here who are in attendance with their classes or on their own volition. That is really powerful, and we appreciate you being here. You'll see from our agenda, we have a couple of speakers before we start. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our esteemed Dean of Tisch College. I'm going to introduce Dean Dana Cunningham, and she will come to the podium to welcome us. So a little bit about Dean Cunningham. It was hard to do this, by the way, to make it little, but I'm going to try to do this briefly. Dana Cunningham is the Pierre and Pamela Amir Dean of Tufts University's Jonathan Tisch College of Civic Life, which we refer to as Tisch College. This is the only university-wide college of its kind because it serves all students. It is promoting college studies that engage civic engagement and involves our young people in looking at our democracies and our community. Dean Cunningham joined Tisch College in 2021 and has devoted her career to promoting civic participation, building community partnerships, and advocating for underrepresented communities. Before leading Tisch College, Dean Cunningham was the founder of the Community Innovators Lab at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. At CoLab, she built large-scale, multi-sector development collaborations. She has also served as the Associate Director of the Rockefeller Foundation and Program Director of the Elias Project at MIT. She is a civil rights lawyer by training, and Dean Cunningham spent years with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Dean Cunningham earned her undergraduate degree at Harvard and Radcliffe Colleges, a JD from NYU Law School, and MBA from MIT Sloan of Management. We are in good hands. So with that, please welcome to the podium, Dean Cunningham.
I'll explain that to them.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see all of you here today. This is actually the inaugural event of the GLADC. And so it was founded in the last year in partnership with the Vuslat Foundation, which is a Turkish institution that is committed to advancing and disseminating ideas, practices, lessons, data about the impact of generous listening. And so we are very excited that we have Merve Shalar here today, who is the director of the Vuslat Foundation. And for us, this is an opportunity for the GLADC Center to have a presence on this campus, advancing generous listening and dialogue in communities in the United States, but also globally, looking at issues of generous listening. So this is a very exciting partnership, and this is a very exciting launch for us of the center. So also want to thank our speakers tonight, Pedro and Rick, Dr. Noguera, and Dr. Hess. So Dr. Noguera reminded me that we've known each other since we were 18 years old. It's been a while. And just very, very excited to have both of you here to engage in a real life practice of deep disagreement, fair, on a set of methodologies around an incredibly pressing question in this country, which is the direction of education, but ability actually to engage, to talk productively across those differences, to engage in generous
turn off the
listening
next
and
one.
dialogue. So this is in our launch event, an opportunity to explore what that looks like in a really polarized, in the context of a really polarized conversation. So Tisch has as its North Star building inclusive and just democracy for an emerging multiracial society in a world that is facing increasing risks, from environmental destruction to economic inequality to racial and ethnic conflict. And so our task is to train a generation of leaders who are prepared to lead in an increasingly risky world. And we believe that a key competency and expertise that leaders must develop is generous listening and dialogue. And those are practices that embody empathy. So for us, the mechanism of sustaining inclusive and just robust democracy are embedded in civic life. So we are the Tisch College of Civic Life. And so we understand that the goal of our work is to strengthen kind of the underlying infrastructure of democracy. That is civil society. And a key mechanism is building leadership that is empathic. So that's what we're doing here tonight in beginning this conversation across differences. We're going to start this in an unusual way with an icebreaker, yeah? So with that, I am going to introduce our very close partner and collaborator, Merv Chalar, who will lead us in an icebreaker.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Before the icebreaker, I'll just say a few words about what Wustad Foundation is and where it's coming from. So I'm the director of Wustad Foundation, and we are partners at Generous Listening and Dialogue Center here at Tisch College, and we are based in Istanbul. And we work to create awareness and to spread the skill of generous listening in the world. And why we focus on listening and listening only is because we are living in a world of deep divides in the US and also in my home country, Turkey. And we are facing pressing issues around mental health and loneliness. And although we are hyper-connected, we still feel lonely, especially amongst youth, and of polarization and of racism, because we cannot bear to listen to each other. We cannot bear to listen to any opposing views other than our own beliefs and our ideologies. And we are living in a time where we are facing climate emergency because of the exploitation of nature for decades. And because we cannot understand that we are a part of nature and not just carelessly using its resources. And we are living in an age of social media where it was promised that it would create more inclusion and help in the idea of democracy. However, when someone is speaking, and we have a voice in social media, but when someone's speaking, another has to listen, and there needs to be receivership. But we are all shouting at each other, and the algorithms that we have designed have actually created even more polarization, and they're designed to push us further apart from each other. And it increases extremism and hostility in exchange for likes and followers. We have a saying in Turkish, and it is to listen with your heart's ear. And this is how this foundation was established, to listen with your heart's ear, to listen with intention, to listen wholeheartedly, without prejudice, without barriers, to listen courageously and to open up space, and to be able to listen to perspectives other than our own, and to not to shut down, but to get out of our echo chambers, and to find that we can live together and to create authentic connections through listening. And although we may not share political ideologies or our views, we share our humanity, and we share our love for our families, we share our passion for our work, and this is how we can live together and flourish. And we are here today not only to hear about different perspectives on K-12 education policy in the US, and not only to reaffirm our views or to oppose others, but we are here to experience an extraordinary act of generous listening between two distinguished scholars. Because what I believe is through generous listening that they have not only been able to talk about their differences, different views, and showed us that not only that it is possible, but it is vital to be able to have these conversations and to listen to each other, whatever our views may be. And this is exactly why at Vuslat Foundation, we are proud to be partners with Tisch College, with Dean Dana Cunningham and with Kenna McKenzie from Generous Listening and Dialogue Center, because we believe in the importance of holding these safe spaces for these conversations to happen. And we believe in inclusion and not otherizing, and we believe in the power of generous listening for a healthy democracy where we don't exist in our own echo chambers only, but we learn to live together. And whatever my personal views may be, my personal political views or on education, I will make an intention to listen generously to Dr. Noguera and Dr. Hess today. And only then can we live together. And what Dean Cunningham was addressing is that at Vuslat Foundation, we work also to find, to develop practices of generous listening. And we believe that it is a muscle that we can tone with practice. And we have simple exercises and prompts, and we want to practice one of them together with you today. It will be very short. It will only take around 5 minutes. And I invite you to turn to the person next to you, and I will give you a prompt and ask this question and listen generously to each other. The question is, what is home for you? What, where, whom? Thinking of home in the broader sense. What do you consider home? And you may find that you are surprised to know someone in a different way, even though you may know each other or create an authentic connection with somebody you don't know. So I invite you to perhaps talk to the person next to you. So we have a few more minutes to wrap up, just like 1 minute. Thank you. We're gonna wrap it up shortly. Can anyone hear? No. They're deep into the comments. So I hope you've had a good conversation. Hello. I hope the conversations that you had that looked really enticing were about where is home. Well, thank you. I hope you enjoyed it and found something interesting in each other. And I hope that you continue this practice and others and try to connect, to create authentic connections elsewhere in life. Thank you. And I look forward to this.
I would like to thank Mava again for a great icebreaker. It's a little taste of what we do at GLADC. And another aspect of what we do, which is also really important, is we practice the art of centering ourselves and be more self-aware for dialogue and listening. So we do have the good fortune of having Dr. Jihyang Padma on our team to help us with those practices, and she will bring us back to the room and centered for us to enter our next part of the program. Thank you, Jihyang.
So this centering is adapted from the writing and teaching of Dr. Howard Thurman, an address he gave at Spelman. So within each person, there's a part of us that is waiting for the sound of the genuine within ourselves. It's good to center down, just letting all those things from the day, like setting them aside for now. What you're going to do later, the beautiful things you're going to hear, just for a moment, centering down in our own heart. And there's something in each of us that waits and listens for the sound of the genuine within other people. It's so easy to say that the person who looks like that, anyone who acts as this person acts, can't hear the genuine. But I must wait and listen for the sound of the genuine in you. I must wait. Where if I can't hear it, then in my scheme of things, you're not even present. And everyone wants to feel like everyone else knows that he or she is here. So there is In every person, that which waits and listens for the sound of the genuine within ourselves. Just for a moment, touching into that right now. There is that in every person that waits and listens for the sound of the genuine in other people. And Thurman said, when these two sounds come together, that is the sound that God heard when he said, let us make man in our image. So I'm secure because I hear the sound of the genuine in myself. And having learned to listen to that, I can become quiet enough to hear the sound of the genuine in you. That is a generous listening. So if I hear the sound of the genuine in me, and I hear the sound of the genuine in you, Thurman said, it's possible for me to go down in me and come up in you. So I see myself through your eyes, having made that pilgrimage. And the wall that separates will disappear and we will be as one because the sound of the genuine makes the same music. That's the place where we're standing on sacred ground, common ground. So trusting in a minute for that, in that sacredness from which everything has arisen. May we enter into a genuine dialogue. Thank you.
So thank you for participating so far and for your attention. We are now going to be welcoming our guest authors to the front of the room to have this experience. I'm going to first introduce Dr. Hess and then Dr. Noguera, and we will have our panel discussion. We will have a Q&A at the end of that panel discussion, including those who are on our Zoom, so that they can enter questions, and we will hold about 10 minutes for that as well. So first, I'll introduce Dr. Hess, who is a senior fellow and the director of the Education Policy Studies program at the American Enterprise Institute in DC. There he works on K-12 and higher education issues. And he is the author of Education Week's popular blog, Rick Hess Straight Up, which I read. He is a regular contributor to Forbes and The Hill and serves as the executive director of Education Next. Dr. Hess started his career as a high school social studies teacher and has since taught at colleges including Rice, Harvard, Georgetown, and the University of Virginia. His books include Spinning Wheels, Letters to a Young Education Reformer, Cage Busting Leadership, and A Search for Common Ground. He holds an MA and PhD in government, and in addition, an MED in teaching and curriculum from Harvard University. So welcome, Dr. Hess. Now allow me to introduce Dr. Pedro Noguera. Pedro Noguera is the Emery Stoops and Joyce King Stoops Dean of the Rossier School of Education and a distinguished professor of education at the University of Southern California. Prior to joining USC, Dr. Noguera served as a distinguished professor of education at the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. Before joining the faculty at UCLA, he served as a tenured professor and holder of endowed chairs at New York University, Harvard University, and University of California, Berkeley. He is the author of 15 books. His most recent books are Common Schooling, Conversations about the Tough Questions and Complex Issues Confronting K-12 Education in the United States Today. This also won the Teachers College Press for the Association of American Publishers in 2022. With Dr. Hess and City Schools and the American Dream, Still Pursuing the American Dream was also published. And in 2022, he was ranked 3rd in the nation for influence and impact in the field of education by Education Week. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Noguera and Dr. Hess to the front of the room. Okay, I will be moderating our discussion this afternoon, and I just want to confirm that we are all set for our Zoom participants to see. Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, well, welcome to Tufts University. We're so happy you could be here today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, welcome. So we have talked quite a bit about why we were inviting the two of you. And I have to say, we want to thank our colleague, Kelly Stiegler from Circle, who mentioned the book and we got into this conversation. But for our audience that may be less familiar, I would love for you all to frame your conversation as to why this is so magnificent and what it is about you two that makes this unique. So I'm going to start with Dr. Noguera.
So great to be here. Haven't been on this campus for a very long time. It's good to be back. The idea of the book comes from Rick. Rick is the one who approached me one day, I think it would via email, and said, I have an idea for a book. It would be an exchange of letters between you and I on a number of controversial topics in education. And although I was already busy doing other work, I immediately said yes, because I thought this is a great idea. It's really needed. And I thought it would be great to work with Rick on the project. So that's how it came into being. Ironically, we've worked on this now for over 3 years. We produced a book, we produced dozens of webinars, podcasts, and it's the first time we're actually seeing each other in person today. So one of the reasons why I decided to fly across the country to do this is to do this, to see Rick. So is that enough background? Okay.
Thank you. And Dr. Hess, did you want to add anything to that?
You know, I mean, I think, you know, this point of like, why does it seem that some people have found the book useful? I think, as Pedro alluded to, there's just not a lot of this. There's not a lot of it because it's not what people are inclined to do right now, given the way we think and talk. It's also not, frankly, it's not what's rewarded right now. Whether you're thinking about funding, whether you're thinking about in-group and out-group incentives, whether you're thinking about what, you know, for me particularly dishearteningly, does not seem to be something that has a lot of traction in the academy, where I would think something like this would get more traction than in the worlds of policy or politics. And so I think what Pedro and I set out to do was, one, just something that would feel better than being frustrated by the state of our conversations. You know, lighted candles, just a better way to spend a little time. Two, I think we talk about the importance of generous listening in these kinds of circles, but we don't always have good examples of what it looks like to do it in practice. And so I think this has provided that. And for me, probably the most rewarding thing was we started this thing probably just a month or two before COVID hit. We started this about January 2020, if I recall right. And so it was, you know, through we wrote the letters probably through the first 6-7 months of 2020. So that was COVID, that was George Floyd. These were emotional, heated times. And it was very easy, especially when you're isolated in those early months of COVID, all of your interaction was virtual. So you would see people online, you would read things, you would see tweets, and people would say things which I just found ludicrous. And writing back and forth with Pedro, for me, was enormously heartening and grounding and gratifying, because it was a chance to say, well, how the hell could somebody think that? And when Pedro would react and talk to me as me, and we weren't just throwing around loaded terms and buzzwords, I was like, all right, oh, I get it. I disagree, but this makes a lot more sense than it did to me when I just saw the tweet. And I think part of the problem is that the way we interact, the way we tend to all retreat to our in-group right now, the way we have so much interaction virtually and through social media, is we're missing a ton of that context that lets us treat disagreements as honest disagreements rather than good guys and bad guys.
Yes, thank you for that. I really appreciate you framing that. And for those who are less familiar with the debates in education, I think what also made this really powerful when I observed the exchange is knowing that you two would be defined as being one being progressive, one being conservative. And like you said, perhaps that is not happening where that commonality is sought after. So I'm curious about what led you then to think about reaching out to Dr. Noguera, given that you are, sort of usually pinned as opposites on the ideological scale.
Yeah, I mean, being a right winger like me has been doubly frustrating the last couple of years, last 5 years, partly because the American right has been enamored, much of it has been enamored with Trumpism, which is, fundamentally anti-intellectual. It's kind of the worst kind of William Jennings Bryan populism run amok. And it's tribal and it's simplistic. And it's just enormously frustrating. So we have conversations that are much more about, grievance than about analysis or ideas. And at the same time, it's frustrating, particularly to be a right winger, it has been for years, because the centers of American intellectual life, campuses, the elite media, I find woefully tone deaf and disinterested in honest conversation, and hostile to the kinds of ways I want to think about or talk about these issues or the values I even bring to them. And so for me, it's really easy to just sit in front of my laptop and get frustrated with the whole world. And I spend a lot of time trying to foster and engage more constructive conversation on the right. You can all judge for yourselves whether people like me are making any difference on that count. I don't know. But one of the things that marked education when I first started my PhD at Harvard in the 90s, and when I was a professor at UVA, and was there was a high degree of purpleness to education. There were fault lines, but they tended not to be right-left. And so that was interesting and rewarding. And over the last 5-7 years, it's become much more polarized around ideology. And I wanted to try to do something about that and the opportunity. And so then I started thinking to myself, if I want to try to talk these things out and show people what it looks like to talk about, who's on that other side from me that I really trust and respect? And I was thinking, and Pedro was the first name that came to mind. And I said, what the heck? And I reached out and I said, well, have you interest? And you heard Pedro recount how that played out.
Right. Well, thank you. We appreciate you two taking on this endeavor and modeling for us. And you both mentioned the academy, and we heard all of the different spaces that everybody has been in, a lot of overlap. And I'm wondering, in higher education institutions like ours, for academics and professionals, where do you think this can happen? Do you think we have spaces where this can happen right now? Aside from our formal conferences and so forth, are there any spaces where this kind of diverse perspective is being shared that you're aware of?
I think that it's a real problem right now in higher ed. There's a lot of fear of saying the wrong thing and being canceled. There's a lot, and as a result, instead of encouraging open discussion of issues, you see it shutting down. And just yesterday at a faculty meeting, I made a statement in front of the 100 or so faculty that diversity in perspectives is a form of diversity we have to respect, right, and encourage, and that we do our students a disservice if we shut that down. And immediately, and it's funny, the people who disagreed were online, so they're sending their comments via chats, and they said they have that. They said, I want a conservative perspective in my class. They can watch Fox News. And I said, look, I'm not going to tell you what to teach, but I will tell you this: if Your students don't get to learn about charter schools because you think that anybody who supports charter schools is a right winger. You've done them a disservice. And I think that any attempt to silence people who disagree is actually the opposite of what we should be doing. And I just showed Rick a moment ago a text from a professor. Thank you for saying that. And what was interesting is, I think the overwhelming majority of people in the room agreed with me, but were not willing to speak up. And that's what I mean about the fear.
Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, I was sharing with Pedro, I until recently, I used to teach at a number of elite universities. I won't teach at them anymore. It's not worth the reputational risk to me of taking money from university to teach there, because I've had students, we did a bipartisan statement in 2015 with Stacy Childress and I, New School Venture Fund headed this up, Brittany Patnett, who's one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, Teach for America when Michael Brown was killed in St. Louis, Howard Fuller, about 22 of us, about 10 or 11 Rs, 10, 11 Ds, signed this thing in 2015 about the ways in which we need to talk constructively about our disagreements, about issues of race and polarization and the rest. This was the document that these doctoral students at UPenn used to pull out a sentence, which I still stand by. I think it was great. It was like that those of us on the right see a lot of the language of the left as, you know, as grievance-based. And they took this to a professor, and the professor, instead of saying, yeah, people write things, and they instead reported me to the head of a program, who called me to tell me that I needed to change what was being. This is not unusual for folks who think like me in higher ed. Whenever I write stuff, I write a lot of stuff about this, and I will get, I mean, any number of emails from, you know, colleagues who say, yeah, gee, thanks for saying that, Rick. You know, I can't say it here. And I think what happens is I think a lot of faculty want that. Most faculty, in my experience, want a culture of live and let live, where there's a lot of room for different methodologies and different perspectives and good faith disagreement. But there is a non-trivial share of students or faculty, 10 or 15 or 20%, I think at many campuses, who have an outsized voice, and the administration is unwilling to push back, is unwilling to play the role of institutional safeguard, and instead folds. And what has happened is, for people like me, it just becomes an environment that is enormously problematic, and in the strangest of ways. So, you know, about 25% of institutions now report that they're using diversity, equity, and inclusion statements for promotion, for tenure, full professor. About 40% are either doing it or saying they're thinking about doing it. About 1 in 5 job postings require DEI statements. Well, as you may be aware, that turns out there's actually right and wrong answers on DEI statements. If you've seen the rubrics, for instance, that if you expressed a perspective that anti-racist norms are necessary to pursue an equitable learning environment, you are scored highly on these rubrics. If you say that in your understanding, diversity, equity, inclusion means adopting a perspective in which all students are treated equally, regardless of race or ethnicity, that is the wrong answer, and you are marked out on these rubrics. And there's a number, and this, if there's anything that sounds like it ought to be in practice, if anything that sounds like it ought to be in theory, an idea that all of us can link arms on, it would be DEI. For people who don't have problems with race-based policies and practices like me, the reality of how these things play out is extraordinarily different.
So thank you for saying that. And hopefully we're learning a little bit more too as an audience. I mean, I know this, but if you haven't read the book, which is available outside, you can see a discussion on these multiple issues of difference. One of the challenges, I think, as we are facilitating conversations is that we like to ensure that those participating understand that the objective is not to advocate for your perspective and to win at the end of the facilitated dialogue. Now, you all were able to do this and shift a little bit in perspective or understanding. But can you talk a little bit more about the value, if any, in dialoguing and not necessarily doing so in a debate fashion to perhaps win over the other side? Is there a benefit to simply understanding more?
Yeah, something we've talked about quite a bit, which is that doing this exchange as we did through letters, as opposed to doing it like we are now on stage, is actually better. Because when you have a chance to write, you have a chance to think, you have a chance to get some references to back up what you think, you have a chance to revise what you thought. You have a chance to really think about what the other person said before you respond. And that ability to reflect really, I think, makes for a more thoughtful exchange than you get on a TV show or even on a live debate. I will say this though, because I want to be clear. I do think there are issues where I am unequivocally, because I think it matters of principle and ethics. I think on questions of justice, of fairness, human rights, I don't see a whole lot of wiggle room. I'll give an example. We had a case at USC recently where a graduate student tweeted, "Kill all Zionists." And then the stage debate, is this free speech? And the chief legal counsel said yes. And I said, I think as soon as you put kill in there, it's a problem. Especially now when people are killing each other. And because if you are a Zionist, you think I might be in danger now from this person. And we have to treat that kind of language differently. If that person has said, I don't like Zionists, I have a real problem with Israel, that's clearly free speech to me. But I think that a lot of institutions are struggling with these issues. Where does free speech begin? Where does censorship enter? And I think that it's really important for people who exercise leadership to model the kind of leadership that we want to see and not be afraid of saying the wrong thing. It's interesting because a lot of people, who was interested in this book and who's not, right? A lot of people who are, I think, kind of in the big middle are interested. At the extremes, not interested. They already got the answer. Why are you even talking to this guy? Right? And you're a sellout for even talking to this guy. So that is, I think, a reflection of where we're at. And so if more people don't model the ability to have respectful civil debate, I think we're really in trouble.
To build on what Pedro just said, I mean, I think this, the kill all Zionists is act, right? I mean, that's not academic speech, right? That's not why universities exist. That's not intellectual engagement, right? That's an epithet. And free speech protects epithets, but academe is not in that business. Academe does need to create room for people who have fundamentally different views on the state of Israel to engage in debate, marshal their evidence, make arguments that other people find fundamentally wrong-headed. And so what Pedro and I did in this book was we weren't engaging in free speech. We weren't just saying things back and forth. We were trying to understand issues we're trying to understand why we disagree on these things. Because look, part of the advantage of doing it with Pedro is I know that he knows as much or more about all these questions than I do. And he's read everything I've read. So the idea that like in a Fox or MSNBC panel, that you're gonna pull out the zinger, that's not what we're in the business of here. So it wasn't like, have you ever thought of this? Because I knew Pedro had. So engaging in this kind of conversation then becomes, well, why are you not persuaded by this fact the same way I'm persuaded by this fact? What are you bringing to it? What are you seeing in it that I'm not seeing? And when you do that back and forth, the advantage of, if you're busy trying to win, if you spend all your energy working on the zinger, or you spend all your energy trying to close the sale, if you can set that aside, what you get to do is you get to focus on, wait a minute, what am I missing? And that's useful. That's selfishly useful because it lets me sharpen my own thinking. It lets me ask if there's points of agreement that I've overlooked. It lets me ask if there's different ways to advance things that I believe in. And frankly, next time I actually am debating, it gives me better arguments to take in that are actually built around what they're saying rather than what I thought I was hearing.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I know, the students I speak to often are wondering what the distinction is between dialogue for understanding and debating and trying to understand the nuance there. And I think you all have made the point, which is there can be places where there is not going to be agreement and you agree to disagree, but you're also trying to understand the perspectives where there might be some common ground, or at least to just better understand, as Marve pointed out earlier, because we have to live together. And where the university can support that is where we're trying to go with this work. So one of the things I want to get to for our students here are, what are some of these essential skills that you all had to draw from? If we were looking beyond content knowledge, what are the types of things that we really should be building in our future leaders to be able to do these kinds of exercises?
I think Pedro and I have talked about this a lot. It's kind of like going to the gym or not going to the gym. When your gym was shut during COVID for 6 months, and the first time back, all your muscles have atrophied. If you're used to, being able to walk 3 miles, suddenly you can only walk 1 mile. Well, I think that's what happened to a lot of us. Social media creates this one-dimensional vision of who you're talking to. When you're talking to somebody in real life, there's body language, something, you often know each other a little bit, their kids, or you know their ex-girlfriend or something. So there's a conversation is grounded in humanity, and it's hard to be just an obnoxious schmuck. So you wind up talking and engaging, and that builds a degree of trust. When you're engaging on social media, when you're hearing people on the radio, when you're seeing them on cable news, you're missing all of that. You're getting 30-second snippets or 140 or 280 character tweets. And if you like them and it's a simplistic, mindless take, you fill in all the detail. You go, oh, well, of course, Senator Cruz or Senator Warren knows all the other issues. They're just saying this because they only have 15 seconds to make the point. And if you don't like what they say, you go, what a simpleton. They don't understand any of it. And what happens, I think, is the first thing then is to get out of all of these terrible habits that we have gotten into in social media and that some kids have just grown up with on social media, where you treat the dumbest thing that you can find somebody saying on the other side as the default argument that side is making. So that's the first thing. Second thing is building those muscles means finding opportunities to engage and then practice. It's just like practicing anything else, from the flute to soccer. It's actually finding somebody to talk to. Kids aren't necessarily going to do this. Kids or college students or anybody isn't necessarily going to do this on their own. And so a crucial piece of it is creating opportunities and creating expectations around it. And then a third piece is, look, Pedro and I, we had a bunch of advantages in this. One of them is that we are successful enough that we didn't have much to fear. People on our own sides often, can come after you if you're not toeing the line. But we're in positions and we've done well enough that we're kind of insulated from a lot of that. Well, if you're asking a typical 8th grader or college sophomore to put themselves out there, they don't have any of that. And especially if you're a 25-year-old at some advocacy group, you're expected that there's a right side and a wrong side on a lot of these issues. And if you're asking people to open themselves up beyond that, you need to create safe, not just tell them they're safe for this 30 minutes in this room, but make them feel safe when they leave that room and somebody says to somebody else in the cafeteria, can you believe what they said? And then somebody is going to put it up on social media or hassle them or try to embarrass them. We need to think about, how do we create learning environments where people can actually think out loud and they don't have to worry about the consequences of doing so.
And I would say that right now, the politics and the media contribute to the polarization, right? Because the politicians that get the most attention typically are the loudest and saying the most provocative things, I'd say, especially on the right. And I think that it's important that to the degree that we're engaging in the public sphere, that we not just feed that, right? That we actually try to do it in ways that deepen understanding. So I'll give you a recent example of my attempt to do that. Some of you may have heard about the racist comments made by some members of the LA City Council that were caught on tape and then released. And now there are demands from all across the country, including Biden, saying they should resign. So today there's an op-ed that I wrote with a colleague in the LA Times, and it's an analysis of why they were saying the things they said. So it's not to, I don't defend their racism, but we have to understand where's their resentment and their frustration coming from? So LA is a city that's over 50% Latino. And they can't understand why Latinos don't have more power. But in their mind, it's a zero-sum game with Blacks, that if Blacks get more, they get less. And there's a good chance that a Black woman will be elected mayor of LA in a city that's less than 7% Black. What they don't see is the reason why she's getting elected mayor is not because she's gonna get everybody Black in America to vote for her, but because she's speaking to issues that cut across race, like housing and jobs and things that matter to lots and lots of people. And I think that that's what gets lost very often is there are common interests that do transcend political divisions and racial divisions. And if we can do a better job, when I would travel more into red states and speak to in places like Texas and Arkansas, I was given a tour when I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, of the neighborhood Greenwood that was burned to the ground in the Tulsa race riot of 1924 by a retired police officer who was serving on the city council, Republican. He said, this is the neighborhood, this was what was called Black Wall Street, burned to the ground by white racists. And he said, this community deserved reparations. They never got it. He said, what we're doing now is we built up this community center and we are doing community schools. And I said, you said reparations. He said, that's right. He said, because what happened here was wrong. There's no way to justify it. And something needs to be done to repair it. And I don't know if he would say that publicly, it was one-on-one, but that, again, a reminder that sometimes, despite the positions that we hold, there are ways of understanding issues that transcend some of these divides. And if we can do a better job at identifying those, we might actually get into a place where we could solve more problems rather than just engage in more attacks.
And just to build on what Pedro said, I mean, one opportunity here, particularly when we think about schools and colleges, is a lot of these conversations play out in forms of kind of a meta media narrative. So, book banning is something we're talking about. Well, actually, most of what is supposedly book banning, according to like the Ed Week headlines, is not. It's arguments about whether books which contain some pornographic images ought to be stocked in school libraries. People can disagree in good faith, but book banning is an effort to drive books out of all libraries. It's an effort to stop the publication of books. If you may remember, half a dozen Dr. Seuss books, for instance, were canceled a couple of years ago. It was a big fuss, and they were canceled because they were thought to have, problematic racial images. So that was concerns from folks on the progressive side about whether books are being published. This is concern generally from more conservative parents about whether middle school or elementary libraries ought to have books that contain pornographic images. You could say, of course they belong in there because they touch on important topics, but we don't do ourselves any favors by saying, are you for or against book banning? Similarly, when we talk, for instance, about the Georgia voting legislation that caused such a ruckus last year, that led to the All-Star baseball game being moved, you know, a federal judge appointed by President Obama ultimately threw out the suit, arguing that all of the provisions in it comported with the Voting Rights Act. A much more fruitful conversation, I think, to talk about these places of agreement and disagreement is, what are the specific provisions? What were the provisions about availability of water within how many feet of the polling place, about drives, about work hours? And students can then have arguments about whether they think these are unfair or problematic or racist in intent. That's cool. But that's a very different conversation when you're talking about specific elements of policy or specific data points, rather sweeping arguments about whether are you a voting suppressor, or are you in favor of democracy? That just doesn't leave a lot of room for people to build those muscles. And what Pedro and I kept doing on these issues was, because we knew enough and we knew each other enough, we were able to go down when you're talking about standardized testing, or you're talking about school choice, about these issues. It turns out that there's a mixture of points of agreement and disagreement. And we weren't persuading each other, but we were frequently finding at least some points of agreement, even where we mostly disagreed, because if you're sensible and interested, you're like, oh yeah, that part makes sense.
I definitely want to talk a little bit about your process. And I remember reading, in particular, the school choice discussion. In the beginning of the pandemic, I was sharing the story with a colleague of mine. There were many parents who were panicking about what to do with regard to whether they should go to a homeschool or independent school or stay with their local schools, because it is a place where many people hold a lot of value and belief in how to pursue that. And I'm wondering, what was that exchange like for you all? And did either one of you walk away with it thinking something slightly different, or feeling like you thought in a sort of more flexible way about it? Or how did that go for you? Because I thought that was an interesting exchange, in particular, that it is something that was very pressing during the pandemic as well, what to do about schools.
And we both are fathers of kids. Yeah, I mean, I think we probably weren't that far apart, actually, on that, because in California and LA, kids were kept out of school for a very long time. And now we're seeing the effects of that. And, you know, even the American Pediatrician Association said, this is not good for children to be in isolation for this long. And I think, you know, so reasonable protections for children, for teachers and others in schools, you know, I don't know too many states that got it right with respect to that. But I think, again, it was the kind of issue that if you had privilege, you could figure out a solution for your kid that would work, right? And I was able to do that. My wife organized a learning pod with other parents, so she got in-person learning. As we're in LA, we can do that outside. But most kids were not getting that. And it was not fair. It was blatantly not fair. And so I don't think this was an issue that where we had a lot of disagreement. You know, I don't know, as I recall.
Yeah, I mean, you know, for me, I mean, I'm certainly more of a choice enthusiast than Pedro is. I'm in favor of the whole sweep: education savings accounts, vouchers. Not because I think it fixes education. I don't think it's an intervention. It's not like a reading program. So I'm always skeptical of studies where somebody says, this raises test scores this much. But what it does is it creates opportunities for new kinds of schools to emerge, for new learning solutions like learning pods. It creates the opportunity for families to meet all kinds of needs. But Pedro, you know, and Pedro, I think, it takes grief because he, for instance, has always been, I think, much more. He's not. I don't want to speak for you, but Pedro, you're much more skeptical of like vouchers and such than I am. but he's always been open to charter schools. And he's taken a grief from some of his friends on the left for it, and so be it. But where Pedro, I think, really, forced me to like articulate, yeah, absolutely, is he would say, well, all right, choice is fine, but choice has to actually exist. And so if you are in rural communities where there's no viable options, I mean, that's exactly right. We have to think differently about what do we mean by choice. And if you're in a setting where you're not providing transportation or families don't have feasible access, the fact that you have theoretical choice doesn't mean that you actually get to put your kid in that learning. So part of this conversation, again, if we're talking about the real lives of families and kids, rather than theoretical debates that we get to have on cable news, it gets a lot more complicated.
And I have to say, I mean, I was on the Obama transition team when he first got elected, helping to think through the kind of policies. And the more critical I became of the direction the Obama administration was going in education, the more they like, we don't want to talk to this guy anymore. Because I went to them and told them, I said, why are you, basically the policies of the Obama administration to me were almost identical to those of the Bush administration on education. They put a lot of emphasis on charter schools. I said 95% of kids are in public schools. What are you going to do for them? And so I think that to be able to criticize even those who are in your camp, right? Unions, Democratic politicians. I don't know if you were open with your criticism of Trump, but
Oh,
okay.
remember, I mean, I remember like on the school choice thing. Remember, I did a USA Today op-ed. School choice can't afford to be Trump choice. That the Trump administration had to stay out. No, absolutely.
I mean, because that's important, I think, to not just because, and then to even point out, and I won't even name them, but a lot of people who are anti-charter have their kids in private school or in screened public schools. They're not having their kids in the schools that are terrible, and that no one should have their children in. So to me, there's a lot of hypocrisy in the debate, and I'm not unwilling to call that out.
And I mean, that's an important piece. Again, when we think about the skill building, if you're a 25-year-old and you're working in one of these organizations, there's only so much that it makes sense for you to do. If you say things that challenge the CEO of your organization or make it harder to get funding next year, you're out of your job. And politicians are rewarded for saying, for playing these games. And so the people whose job it is to call BS, to explain that things aren't that easy, are people who are academics, people who work in think tanks, journalists. And one of the most frustrating things for me over the past 5 or 10 years has been how often I feel like the people who live these enormously privileged lives that Pedro and I get to live, where we don't have to lift anything heavy, where we get to spend all day writing stuff and chatting to people on TV and radio, and we get good salaries for this. How many people who have this privilege have instead chosen to then be part of the problem and spend all of their time playing amateur politician and flaming people and writing angry, stupid tweets and being part of kind of these cartels on the right or the left that are trying to like silence or dox one another. If you don't want to take the responsibilities of these positions, then quit. Go work in an advocacy group, go work in a partisan group, go run for office, and let people who are willing to shoulder the institutional responsibilities be the nation's professors and think tankers. And what's frustrating to me is how often we're rewarding, I think, people who are choosing to play games rather than take on the roles they've chosen to take on.
Well, I appreciate the comments too about in these spaces where we're supposed to be solution oriented, trying to go for that. And I think with everything going on around us, we are all a little worried that the idea of bipartisanship may be fantastical at this point. While we are here in this setting where there is, hopefully more safety and ability to think, what ideas do you have for our students and our faculty and staff who are here as to how to create these kind of spaces to allow for this as much as possible?
Dean?
I think people in leadership starts with the kind of need to encourage it actively, and then it needs to encourage that discussion about the importance of diverse thinking and perspectives in our teaching, in our courses. I think that needs to be modeled and encouraged. Otherwise, it's not going to happen on its own. It's not right now. Again, I think it does involve sometimes stepping out and taking risk, and sometimes people don't like, they think seems like a retreat of some kind. But I think, some of you may know of Jonathan Haidt. He's a social psychologist at NYU, and he was my neighbor when I was at NYU, so I know him pretty well. And he recently made a statement that he was going to quit this professional psychologist association because they require now at their meetings a diversity statement before you present your research. And he's like so opposed to this that he's going to resign his membership. So I wrote to him. I said, as a Jewish man married to an Asian woman, because that's who he is, I think you should do more than merely resign. I think you should explain why you think this kind of statement is silly and not worthy of it, but don't make, because what your resignation seems to imply is that we don't need to be a more tolerant society, and which is what they're trying to do in a very stupid way. But you have, I think, a responsibility to do more than just resign. You need to say what's wrong with it. In California, I don't know if it's true here, people do these land acknowledgement statements, right, before events like these, which to me, the intent is right. We should acknowledge the people who were here, but what does it do? Right? Does it help Native Americans who are here still alive improve their lot? Does it help us to really understand what's happened? I would say when I'm asked to do it, I go further. I say, okay, I'll talk about land acknowledgement, but rather than simply say, I'm not going to do it, I want to push it and force people to reckon with what the intent was, rather than simply to take a stance of say, this is useless, and I'm not going to play this game. So what I was trying to say to my former neighbor, Jonathan, I understand why you're taking that position, but I think you need to go further and explain why, and explain what we should be doing to encourage tolerance and respect in this society.
And what's interesting in the Haidt situation is Jonathan Haidt.
His name is Jonathan Haidt.
It's an interesting example of, because actually, so he objected, there were two things. So one, there was a pledge to equity, inclusion, and anti-racism rather than diversity. And it also, this is the Association for Personality and Social Psychology, I think.
Yeah.
And they also announced, they told the New York University student newspaper that all research submissions would now be judged both on rigor of research and interest of the audience, and then they would be separately judged on their anti-racist. So at that point, the quality of the research is only one value among others that are more ideological and political in intent. Now, Pedro and I did a whole chapter on kind of civics. We got into this because partly, partly again, it's the imprecision of it. Anti-racism, as I wrote we did like 7,000 words, Grant Addison, about 7,000 words a few years ago, talking about, boy, I mean, if there's anything that nobody should be able to object to, it's being anti-racist. The problem is, what the hell do we mean by anti-racism? So, lots of schools and colleges have had students read Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist as part of their commitment to anti-racism. And Kendi, for instance, as the most of the people in this room I think know probably teaches, that there is no such thing as an idea or policy that is anything other than either racist or anti-racist. So anti-racism in Kendi's world means there is a correct stance on everything. There's a correct stance on higher marginal tax rates. They're anti-racist. There's a correct stance on standardized testing in schools. They're anti-racist.
No, they are racist.
They're racist. I'm sorry. Thank you. There's a correct stance on legalization of pot. Legalization is anti-racist. Now, this is not liberal education. This is not saying, let's talk honestly about a complicated racial history of this nation. Let's argue about, what debts are owed. This is saying that there are right and wrong answers. And you either subscribe to the right answers or you're racist. Now, it seems to me that kind of like with the hate situation, what Pedro is saying is like, rather than just retreat to our camps, either I'm on board with this or I exit, there's got to be room to kind of talk about this. And in fact, Haight suggested in his pronouncement that he's going to quit. He said, look, let's have seminars and speakers and all on this, but let's not require that either presenters take the pledge, and let's not judge research based on this criteria. And SPSP declined his suggestion. But I think that, again, part of it is we have gotten into the habit of arguing these things in memes, I always forget, memes, rather than actually taking apart the things and figuring out where do we actually agree and where do we disagree? And can we do something about that?
Well, you've left us with a lot to think about, and I know that there are questions probably being raised in the minds of individuals. So before we pivot to that, I'm just wondering if you have any, sort of closing thoughts about, again, what, as folks read this book, we do want to do a reflection in coming weeks. I hope you'd be interested in hearing feedback as they do that. And we'll be encouraging that as well. So we would like to have our experience here, generous listening and dialogue, to see the outgrowth of the generous listening that's happened in the last half an hour plus. And so we do want to open it up at this point for any questions or comments even that individuals have. And then we will close our panel. So with that, we do have 2 microphones, one here and one over here. If for any reason you need support getting the microphone to you, please let us know. We have some staff who will bring it to you. But do not be shy. And also for those on Zoom, we will be monitoring the chat at this time to see if you have any questions as well. So I will pause here to see if there are any questions or anyone who wants to come forward with a comment, and remembering our desire to have this be a brave space. So please feel free to share your comments.